it is about defining that purposeful direction. So whether you want to call it mission, like what are we about? I think that's why our vision at O&L Therapeutics is to help patients see the future. I mean, it's like a rallying cry, and ultimately for leaders to, with the team, decide what is that direction so that we kind of know where that North Star is, or whatever analogy you want to make. But that is critically important on an element of leadership for that.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Going Beyond the Deal podcast. Today, I have David Esposito, CEO of O&L Therapeutics. David, how are you today, sir?
Michael, I'm doing great. Great to be talking to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So I wanted to have David on the show. Very interesting background, West Point graduate, led a platoon in the Gulf War, received a Bronze Star, and now healthcare, biotech CEO and executive. I think there's a lot of really cool stories we could share. And just want to get from like how we went from there to where we are today, and what really helped you out in continuing to grow that. So just let's give a quick overview, quick background on you, David. Tell us about like how you kind of got started in this whole thing.
Sure. I'll go as quick as I can through the Reader's Digest version. So a Jersey kid by birth, ended up with attending West Point, Army-Navy game recently, uncomfortable, tough game, but nonetheless, ended up starting my career, so to speak, at West Point. And to your comment on military, some good foundational leadership development at West Point. Ultimately served in the Army with the 101st Airborne Division during the first Gulf War, was a platoon leader, infantry platoon leader there, and then transitioned off of active duty and got into life sciences. So I've been in the life science field for about 30 years. I think there are, a number of parallels in that leadership journey that now in my role today of leading a biotech company really helped me today. Those fundamental aspects of leadership, clarity of mission, all those things that glad to talk further about that. But, after military service, been a life science guy for about 30 plus years.
See, we can't quit. We can't glaze over this. You said Jersey guy. So where in Jersey are you from?
Right. Born and raised in Hackensack, New Jersey. That's where most of my family started. Then grew up northern Bergen County and Upper Saddle River for most of my adolescent years.
Got it. So for the listeners here, I live in quote unquote central Jersey, but to David, I'm probably in South Jersey because he's a North Jersey guy, but we share that in common. So very, very cool. So tell us about O&L Therapeutics. I mean, very simply, clinical stage biotech company focusing on protecting vision by preventing retinal cells from dying. That sounds really harsh and crazy and complicated. Tell us a little bit about O&L.
Sure. So O&L Therapeutics, based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So a classic university spin-out technology. So our founder, Dr. David Zaks, is a retina specialist at the University of Michigan. David is one of those classic clinician scientists, sees patients, but also runs a lab and does research. In David's research, he identified a receptor on retinal cells called the FAS receptor, FAS, that when the eye gets stressed under disease, that receptor gets activated by immune cells saying, boy, something's wrong. Let me activate this receptor, and ultimately triggers the death of those retinal cells. And unlike skin cells that regenerate, retinal cells in your eye, which principally focus light back to your brain and electrical signals to see, retinal cells don't regenerate. So when those die, you just get a limited supply and begin to get blind spots, patterns in your vision. And so over the years, what O&L has done is we've developed a therapeutic, what in technical terms is a small peptide that basically blocks that FAS receptor. So regardless of the stress or disease in your eye, our drug called zelafacilitide, injected in the eye, blocks that receptor so that the cells of the retina, even if they're under stress or disease, that pathway doesn't get triggered. So the cells can stay alive, and quite simply, the more retinal cells you have, the better you see. And so that's why we're in the business of protecting vision of patients who are suffering from these diseases, because our drug can actually just put a cap on that receptor that protects it from that death signaling pathway.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. But let I can't imagine that when you're in high school, thinking about what you want to be when you grow up, that you would ever have thought that it would be here. So take us like through what happened. You graduate high school, you apply to the military academy. What is the motivation? What is it that David's going to be when he grows up?
Sure. I think in that part of my journey, begun to feel this sense of purpose and calling, serving a cause bigger than yourself. I mean, that ultimately what drew me to West Point and the military academy, that idea of, boy, there's just a bigger cause than me out there, and can I put a shoulder to it and contribute? So that started really my journey of a desire to serve, and certainly West Point continued to cultivate that journey in my time on active duty the same. And that's one of the solidifying aspects of a place like West Point, and in other places of that, of just really a rallying cry to
What
support something bigger.
what do you think? Is there anything that you could pinpoint specifically to that feeling of wanting to serve something bigger? Did something happen when you were younger? Was it, the house you grew up in? The reason why I ask this, right, is I've always been of service. Like that's what I've wanted to do. I've been a Tiger Scout all the way up to the rank of Eagle Scout, right? Where it made me feel good and it made me feel complete to serve. So that's why I've always been in a service industry, right? I wanted to do something to help serve people. Was there anything that happened when you were younger that drew you to that?
No, it's a great question. And I think there are probably a number of events. But, I grew up in a family, my mom's an immigrant from Glasgow, Scotland. My dad's family's from Italy that way. My father's family started a small fruit and vegetable market in Hackensack, New Jersey. And that idea of post-World War II, small business, you become part of the community. And so that idea of a business serving customers, and then, business really serving a place in community, and ultimately led to kind of local politics and all of that, you start to realize there is a bigger picture than just yourself working and producing. The idea of serving to build a family and build a business and build a community is really, I think, perhaps a hallmark of a lot of families up there, but certainly was very meaningful to me. And then, in my journey in terms of the military and seeing that, I was a pretty good pole vaulter in high school, and West Point used to run these track camps over the summer. So as a high school kid, I got a chance to go up to a couple of their camps. And just seeing and being a part of that atmosphere, the cadets are going through their summer training while you're there, and just realizing, boy, what's this all about? This is an institution designed to create leaders to help serve our nation. Really became to be a real calling card for me to say, wow, that is just a real interesting purpose. And those two experiences, I think it's hard to disconnect kind of the upbringing I had that really supported that environment, and then the real play towards seeing what West Point was about in the military just lit a fire in me about that idea of purposeful journey. I certainly have carried that into my adult life. I see a real rationale between having a purpose to serve. Certainly helps minimize some of the normal complexities we all run into in life.
Very cool. Very cool. So let me ask you a little bit too. As far as West Point is concerned, I know a little bit about West Point, but it's a very prestigious educational facility, and it's not something that anyone can just get into. And what I think is very interesting is that, a lot of people say, and I'll even say with myself, I graduated high school with good grades and everything, but I still felt that calling. And I said, I'm not sure what I want to do. I need some structure. Maybe I should join the military. But that was a path to figure out what the next step would be. To go to West Point, though, that's intentional. You must be accepted. Can you walk us through that process? I mean, if someone was to pursue that, not just any average everyday person could apply to go to West Point and go there. So can you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure, I think it does. You touch on something that's pretty unique in terms of all folks that have an interest in applying to the academies. I mean, as a young kid at 17, you're making a decision to commit. Depending on the commitments have varied on military service, but it's really 5, 6 years beyond graduation. So you're somewhat laying down a commitment of, call it 7, 8, 9 total years, 10 years as a 17-year-old as part of your commitment to go to West Point and ultimately serve. And so, that in and of itself is a real intentional thought process for people who may say, hey, it might just be great to go to school there and get an upbringing. It's like, no, you're really making a long commitment with it. So I think that's part of the process. And then it's a lengthy application process. I did it this 35 plus 40 years ago now if I do the math for me but ultimately it starts in junior year of high school. So you're taking physical exams, you got to get a congressional nomination. So it's more than just the normal collegiate application to put together all of those things. So that's quite the journey as well, just to be able to put all those forward. And Michael, just like it was when you or I trying to go to school, and now it's just incredibly all these top tier schools, even beyond the academies, are really tough. But it is a lengthy process and a number of different approvals or acceptances beyond just the academy. Certainly congressional appointments, physically, you got to pass the exams, all of those kind of things to ultimately get in there.
Very interesting. But what you touched on, though, it's an education that helps create leaders. And the reason why I want to dig into this a little bit more, I've been working in banking and the investment banking, business now for years. And what I found very interesting is I see a lot of really strong operators that are out there that are now running roll-up strategies for private equity companies, all these different things. And then you come to find out, oh, actually they served in the military. Okay, former Green Beret, former this, former that. And it's like, oh, whoa. That was not what you expected to see, but it's a very common theme. One thing at our firm, at DBD Investment Bank, is we typically hire a lot of athletes. Why do we hire a lot of athletes, right? Because number one, they're competitive, they're intentional, they're very strategic about what they do. And it just shows the type of person it is. It's just so funny to me now that private equity and dealing with a lot of these companies, it's a lot of former military. So what about it? What about West Point really created leaders? And how does that differ from the average everyday, most of your friends that went to Rutgers University here in, the state school? What's the difference between the two, and how does it create better leaders?
Great question. So I would just touch on too the idea of athletes as well. That on a team sport, you're part of something bigger on the field. You're working together. You're accomplishing, relying on each other. So I think many of those aspects are similar. But I think with West Point, one is it is a cauldron of leadership. So you start out learning to follow. That's one of the real principles of that start. Is you're a plebe as a freshman year. That term specifically. You are a follower. And you have the opportunity not only to follow all kinds of leaders, but you get a chance to really be observers of leadership. And I think that provides a real foundational element to realize at the end of the day, leaders also need followers that execute. And so you learn the basics, but those 4 years, you are constantly rotating leadership positions. So you do a lot of following in that beginning, but even in that freshman plebe year, you're still having leadership tasks put on you. And then throughout 4 years, you're not only observing leaders, but you're modeling leadership, whether you become a squad leader, a platoon leader, a company commander. That whole journey gives you a great deal of perspective. And I think, in addition to being taught formal instruction on leadership, you're in it day to day. And just like running a company, or as you described in investments, like, that experience is the greatest teacher we can all have. And you're afforded that at West Point in a real intentional, intense way, which I think helps to produce, terrific leaders down the road.
And so you said that that's all really, really, really great points. But now you go through your 4 years at West Point, and where most people would be out looking for that next job, right? You actually have to, I don't want to say pay back, but you have to give service now. What does that look like from going from a educational classroom, everything that you're doing there, to then going overseas? Like, I mean, that must be that must have been shocking to you. Just like, how does that work? Walk us through that.
Well, I think it also, it's the ultimate calling for 4 years of training, to ultimately become what you graduate as a second lieutenant in the Army, to lead men and women in a unit, so the whole building blocks for that 4 years is really wired to that ultimate engagement, leading men and women in the military. So I think in many ways, it's really a building to that energy to be able to do that. But at my time that I was there, Michael, this was mid 80s to late 80s. I graduated in 1990. We had a lot of senior military instructors who went to West Point mid 60s, late 60s, and went straight to Vietnam, and so there was a lot of that instruction of, hey, we may be in a prolonged period of peace. There were a couple of conflicts, invaded Grenada in 83, 89, Panama. But, in terms of coming out of Vietnam, it was a relative quiet period. And so, but there was still that drumbeat of be ready at all times when you graduate. And ultimately graduated in May of 1990. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait August 1st, 2nd of 1990, and that kicked off the first Gulf War.
So when did you leave? So when you graduated, and then when did you leave?
Yeah, the typical journey for a graduate is you go into the officer basic course for a couple months. I had a few trainings, so I ended up going over there towards kind of late fall, early winter into Iraq, and introduced to my platoon and the 101st Airborne over there in Iraq. They had already deployed a few months prior to that. And so that, that in and of itself was, just an incredible experience to think, especially graduating, if you wheel the clock back, May of 1990, all right, maybe there's not a ton going on in the world. It was certainly the collapse of Russia was in process and all of that, but it seemed like the Cold War was ending, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, this breaks out, and at the time administration rallied most of the world to that cause, which was an exciting event to be a part of.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, if I haven't said it yet, and I will say it much more times throughout this, but thank you so much for your service. We greatly appreciate that. So the majority of our listeners today are going to be executives, business owners, professionals, people that have leadership roles, but might not have been in some of the positions that you have been. What I would really love for a takeaway for this is for someone to really walk away with some knowledge on leadership, some different things that we could break down for them. Could you maybe share with us your top 3 lessons that you've learned in leadership that anybody could use?
Yeah, sure. I'd say it's a great topic, right? Ultimately, I really feel everything rises and falls with leadership, even in my life science journey. Certainly, it's high risk from a development standpoint, but ultimately, leadership finds a way. So, I think one is, it is about defining that purposeful direction. So whether you want to call it mission, like what are we about? I think that's why our vision at O&L Therapeutics is to help patients see the future. It's like a rallying cry, and ultimately for leaders to with the team, decide what is that direction so that we kind of know where that North Star is, or whatever analogy you want to make. But that is critically important on an element of leadership for that. And then I think the second piece really comes down to, you have to build a plan to ultimately get there. And that plan is not only kind of work through with everybody, but you got to set the example in that plan. So that gets back to the work, the putting the shoulder to it. You're never above doing the menial tasks, all of that. So I do think it's setting that calling and then building that plan, putting the effort yourself into that plan. And I think the third piece that, Michael, that I really only have come to really appreciate over the last handful of years as a leader of very small teams and then really big teams, is that, you're setting that big direction, right? Where are we going? You got the plan. How's everybody doing? That's great. Yep, we got it. But you have to really crystallize in everybody's mind, like, what their specific role is to that plan to ultimately get to that long-term goal and vision. And I say that because when people can really sync up how their work matters to that plan and that vision, they start to get energy around that and start to see themselves, their own purpose, their own abilities matter to the team to deliver on the plan, to get to that long-term goal. And I think from a high level, leadership really is about, setting that long-term direction that's energizing and purposeful, building that plan and being a part of executing that plan, but then really getting at the individual level to see I matter to that plan is helpful.
How do you confirm that with the people that work under you? I mean, how do you know that they know how they're part of it? I mean, how do you determine that at least they're heading in the right direction? Is there anything that you do just to make sure that, like, obviously you want to get people's input on these things, but then how do you confirm their input is going to be in alignment with the greater plan? How do you do that as a leader?
Yeah, I think it is an iterative process, right? But I do think, at some point, people have to buy in to that long-term direction, right? And you're either like being a part of eye disease and this journey of ups and downs of the biotech, or you kind of don't. But I think, so feeling your own sense of energy and purpose towards that long-term goal, just like in the military, we got a mission to take a bridge, or, all those kind of things, that you got to see yourself a part of that. But then it comes down to, when building that plan, it's a constant degree of communication, not only in my role to investors, the board, and the team, but principally, to your question, the team. Hey, this is, where we are. This is what we're headed towards. Here's the plan. Here's all the specifics we're accomplishing. And then you, as a team member, do you understand where we're going? Let's talk about that, and why this task that you're working on, whether it's an administrative task or it's meeting with an investor or following up with some scientific partner, how that task ties to where we're going, and why it's important to deliver on time and what we have, because we got budgets and all those. So I do think, Michael, it is a heavy lift on communication, very clearly at the individual level and team level, that helps to solidify over that time. I'm also, a big believer that, you can maybe get on stage and woo a crowd and get everybody energized. At the end of the day, that's like a nice quick pump up, right? But where it really becomes the magic, so to speak, and there's no magic, it's in the consistent, disciplined follow-up, communications, how you doing, how can I coach you get there? That ultimately, what in the long term helps people stay engaged and energized, but also, Michael, it also helps people to know whether, man, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe it's just not for me. And then how do we find kind of purpose and direction in those situations, which are always tough.
Very cool. How do you manage, personally, like the doubt and fatigue and pressure when everyone's looking to you for answers?
No, that's a really good one, right? Because this stuff is hard, and it's never easy. The science is complicated. I do think, well, it goes maybe. So if I gave you 3 points, maybe I'll throw a fourth one on there. I mean, I think at the end of the day, for a leader, you gotta believe tomorrow is going to be a better day. I mean, that spirit of optimism has to come out. I mean, I'm leading a small biotech company. There's a gut punch every other day coming out, whether the technology, how we make it, how we open up clinical trial sites. But you got to believe that tomorrow's going to be a better day. And I say that, Michael, back to the point about people and the team. The biggest motivator I found for the teams over the years is that, hey, we've overcome a couple challenges a couple weeks ago. We can slay this one. We just got to get around the table. We got to talk about it, get some energy on it. So that building of, hey, we've been down this path before. Let's just get our heads around. It's complicated, but man, we'll solve it. That's the other piece of leadership that's important to say. The reality is it is going to be hard. It is going to be a slug. We're going to journey through some darkness. But just like before, we'll get on the brighter side of this thing. I think that's important. Otherwise, and again, the other practical reality is the sustainability of people in that environment is not for everybody, and that's the other part that you realize everybody's got their own capacity limits, and they got their own story in their head they got to kind of work on because it's not easy.
Yeah. Very, 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 very interesting. Now, let's get into this. I like to ask everybody this, high-performing leaders like yourself, what are some of your daily non-negotiables and routines? I'd love to hear that they've been the same ones that you've had since you were at West Point, but maybe you could just kind of take us through what you're doing on a daily basis to keep this high level of leadership.
Yeah. Oh, appreciate the question. Now, I'd first say, right, there's been around long enough to know that I'm not perfect and always on message, and nobody else is either. That's at least the normal part of it, right? Everybody's kind of working through a few of these things. But I think there are some basic blocking and tackling that are not rocket sciences that I think for most of us are pretty simple. I get the basics of a consistent plan to wake up every morning. I do. It's just consistent early wake up deal. Get a little perspective time, whatever you want to call it. Hey, where am I in this big picture? Where am I going? Draw on my faith. All right, let me get my head around all my worries. Try to put them on the table, sort through them in an early morning. Get a little bit of exercise and try to start off with a good meal, to be able to get going. So I think those basics of, consistent wake up, little bit of exercise, perspective building. Some of those are I've found, at least now, I'm almost 60, 57 here, that the sustainability of a little bit of that is really important. It's the kind of, it's that aft pleasure. Nobody, at least I don't, get up every morning and say, man, I feel like doing 100 push-ups today. I got to still kick myself in the tail to get motivated every day, right, to do those. But I do know the after effect makes me a little bit more energized at work for that perspective. So I think those are some important starting points. And then the other piece of it is in terms of that is like, syncing up. Where are we heading long term? What does that mean medium term? And then what am I doing today and around those kind of basic things? You try to at least over time realize it's important to build a plan. And many times you may have to say to yourself, I don't care if I'm not in the mood today. I got to execute the plan. So most days you come away pretty pumped up, but there are days you're like, man, this stuff's tough. And every now and then, whether it's a teammate, partner at home or whatever, needs to give you a little kick in the pants and say, hey, you got to get the plan done.
Oh yeah. Somebody told me a while ago, and it's been something that's stuck in my head. A good friend of mine, Kyle Newell, AKA the Panda Man. He's a very well-known fitness influencer. And he just said, do what you said you would do. And that's just it. Like every day, I was up at 4:30 this morning. Did I want to get up at 4:30 this morning? No. After all the snow that we had here, after everything that I had to do, did I want to get up at 4:30? Absolutely not. But I did, because I said that I was going to get up this morning. I was going to work out. I needed an hour to sit down and really plan my day before the whole house gets up. I have a 6-year-old at home, so I have to get, once she gets up, then everything's on her. So yeah, it's all about doing what you said you would do.
No, Michael, I tell you, at the end of the day, you've been around a while, so have I. I mean, everybody would love a bit of a quick fix on a few of these things. And the reality is consistency beats intensity all the time, so maybe I didn't do 100 push-ups today, but I did a few of them,
There you
and
go.
over time that gets you going. And that's I think a real honest and very humbling view of a journey for me leading teams or whatever. It's just like, I've never been that kind of dash and flash, overnight. You got to plug and chug. You just keep grinding to the basics. And for the most part, you head in a good direction. I've led a couple, companies that have had really good successes, launch products, good exits, so to speak, and then others that haven't, taken a few companies into bankruptcy. I'd say I kind of operate pretty consistently in both those environments, but outcomes somewhat are different, and you just got to not lose the faith to keep grinding.
So I don't know if I mentioned that I wanted to ask you about this, but it just kind of came to me. So I'm going to throw it there. I'll throw you the ball and then you let me know if you can catch it or not.
Okay.
I have a bunch of different friends that have worked in the biotech space. And there was a long time where I had some of these friends, they were just absolutely crushing it. Like everything was great. It was like the land of milk and honey. Like everything's great. Then all of a sudden things happen with the world, macroeconomics, et cetera, and there's not enough money for trials. There's not enough for this. Can you get into a little bit about this world that you are now a leader of and the difficulties around it, and maybe get into like how you see the success of ONL Therapeutics kind of, going out into the future?
Sure. So I would say, my world's healthcare innovation, life science innovation, the science gets increasingly more complicated. I won't say all the easy problems have been solved because they were complicated back then, but
Yeah.
a lot of things have been solved. The science, human biology continues to get complicated. So the reality is on the numbers that all of these innovations don't get to market. Most fail, whether it's in therapeutics, diagnostics, device, not all of them get to market. But there's an acknowledgement that innovation, certainly in life sciences, whether it's tech, it's important. Innovation drives our way of life going forward. And so there's a need to be able to do that work. But also, there are investment cycles or macro factors that really impact how some of those things get funded. So, for example, over the last handful of years, there was a lot of interest during COVID and post-COVID on how incredible the life science industry was. So you saw a lot in that 2000, 2001 investments coming to companies like ours. We're not in infectious disease and all this, but a lot of money coming in and a lot of companies going public for that. And then the reality is, well, this is pretty hard stuff. And so you see some of the normal investment cycles that in your line of work you probably see from time to time that go that. What happens sometimes in investment in life sciences, you get a bolus of interest and a lot of capital, and it takes a little bit of time to burn that capital off until people are set back into, a lot more M&A occurs to clean up a few things, and you get the investment cycle again. So that over the last 5 or 6 years makes it really difficult for companies like ours to raise traditionally venture capital money because that cycle is still getting worked out. The one that we haven't really seen long-term impact yet, but we're starting to see, these ideas of, trimming down NIH funding and, science foundation funding. Principally, the U.S. government funds a lot of the initial discovery work at academic universities. These are National Institutes of Health grants. It's really important in that very early stage discovery work that gets funded. You and I and a few folks down the street are not going to write $5,000 or $10,000 checks to academic research foundation to try to do that. That's a really positive role that the U.S. government has played over the years of funding basic science research, and that's changed a little bit. It's starting to change over the last year or so, and so those are important pieces that I think the dust eventually settles, and as the U.S. we get back to leading innovation and doing those, and we will. But those are, I would say, macro event headwinds that, eventually over time begin to slow innovation. The marketplace will get back to it. I have faith in that. But those are a couple of the headwinds that make it challenging then to discover new innovation, get venture funding to do it, because everybody eventually sees things. I'll say one other thing too. When you think about the life cycle, most large companies today don't innovate. They look for smaller companies to acquire to build their pipeline of innovation. And when those big companies start to get squeezed on various commercial interests, that starts to dampen their forecasts of what early innovators like O&L can be. And so that also begins to bleed into the ecosystem of, large exits or the right partnerships to make it go. And so for O&L, we're venture funded. We do see a good pathway with the development plans that we have for our drug zelafacilitide. And we're just now in the throes of large clinical trials for that. To kind of bookend maybe your question, we've got about a 2-year trial to run, and we'll see how the results are.
So let's get into that a little bit now. You said that it's a peptide that's actually injected into the eye. When I think of peptides, I'm very much into longevity and, biohacking, et cetera. Peptides have gotten kind of a weird, I don't even know how to explain it, right? It's like, okay, is it a drug? Is it really not a drug? You can try these different peptides now, but they're not really approved, et cetera. I feel like peptides are really the way of the future, that from what I'm seeing on the longevity side. I can't believe, everything from these GLP-1s, all the way down to, different types of things, regenerating tendons and different things like that through injection, but it's still, not FDA approved. But to be able to do what you guys are doing with this through this peptide, where do you see that going? Is there going to be, as you go through these clinical trials, do you see more approval of peptides? And then once we start to see stuff like that, I could see this whole thing just exploding pretty far.
No, great question. So these are, the peptides have been around for a long time. These are, the way I would describe ours is not the longevity type. These are a little bit different.
Yeah, I understand.
But for sure, no, they're, the building blocks of a small peptide versus a whole protein. And can you basically manufacture? We chemically synthesize this product to be able to enable it to be soluble in our liquid, to ultimately be injected into the eye. But I do see, whether it's peptides, large proteins, large molecule biologics, there still is the need for rigorous investigations and manufacturing, scientific evidence generation, and that will continue. I do think there are some exciting things to the point on longevity. We're finally getting out in front of prevention as opposed to focusing on just treating sick people. So that's a real interesting, we probably talk forever, bending in the curve on scientific innovation, finally getting out in front of it. But for us, we are what would be described back of the eye focus. So not with people with glasses, front of the eye lens and all that. The retina is the back of the eye. The cells of the retina is what we try to protect. And so it's a very common method of delivery to inject in the eye. You and I and everybody else who never would hear about that, nobody wants to get a needle in the eye. But for 20 plus years, it's been pretty common practice to treat a condition called wet age-related macular degeneration. And we're focused on what's called dry age-related macular degeneration. But it enables a small peptide like ours to get into the vitreous of the eye and settle back into the back of the eye on the retina so that the drug can penetrate the tissue that it really wants to. So we're not like an intravenous injection or a tablet where you could potentially have a lot of other side effects getting it that way. Gets it into the eye. The eye is somewhat immune privileged to be able to, hopefully the drug does what it does beneficially and doesn't cause any harm. So that's kind of the journey we're on with it, even though it sounds a little uncomfortable on these injections.
Does sound uncomfortable, but it does sound like it's going to help a lot of different people. So who the type of people that we have on, that are listening to this, watching this on YouTube, Is there anybody that, this is your opportunity to speak to the world here. Is there anybody that you'd like to talk to? Anybody that you want to meet that can help kind of support ONL and their journey?
Sure. So, certainly, we always raising capital to be able to advance development. So any institutional investors, venture capital folks out there, love to stay connected with them that way for sure. But also, Michael, I think for the day-to-day folks listening to what you have as a great audience and great podcast for this, I'd love those people to fully appreciate that innovation in our world in life science, but as I said, others, defense, tech, whatever it is critical to the way of life we all enjoy. And we want to be able to support those innovations. And that many times may take the place of where people can really understand that all these innovations don't always make it, but there's good purposeful work going on, and people ought to get behind supporting those innovators, whether it says, if they can, angel investors, or at least cheering people on, because most of these journeys don't always make the highlight reel on CNBC or IPO or big acquisitions. But what we hope in companies like ONL, people have an appreciation to support scientific innovation, to move that forward. Whether we ultimately get to market to help protect the vision of patients with retinal disease, we certainly are working towards that and hope we get there. But if we don't, for whatever reason, we hope we move the science further enough that somebody else can pick it up and make progress, because something like vision or anything healthcare related, we all don't fully appreciate our health until we lose it. And that's an important reminder for people.
Really, really appreciate that. I love how you just said that even if we're not able to do it, and I hope we can get the ball down the field far enough for somebody else to pick it up to finally accomplish the mission. And that's a true leader talking right there. So David, thank you so much for that. I really, really, really appreciate that. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you to find out about ONL Therapeutics?
Sure. Certainly, LinkedIn is a great way to find me and the company, but our website is onltherapeutics.com. People can get updates that way as well. But certainly, this day and age, we're all pretty active on LinkedIn with the business and myself personally. So people should be able to reach out to me. Glad to talk to them. I have a number of good conversations that come up off of LinkedIn connections.
Very, very cool. I appreciate that. So I have to ask you, we call it the $1 million question here on Going Beyond the Deal. I sent it to you. I sent it to David beforehand, so it shouldn't be that surprising here. But when you look back on your journey, personally and professionally, what's one moment that felt small but ended up changing everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, is one of the companies that I led, which was a diagnostic company. We were coming out with a blood test to help identify risk of prostate cancer for a guy like you or I. If we had an elevated PSA and we were looking for a solution beyond a biopsy or something like that, we developed a blood test to measure autoantibodies. And that moment when we launched that product and I sat in front of clinicians interpreting results, ultimately to know that a diagnostic test is never perfect, and to sit there with a clinician knowing the test in this case provided a false negative, which basically would say that patient, the test said they were healthy and they really weren't, brought home the reality for me that nothing is really perfect in science, but you got to have the courage to continue to persevere, to move, to the analogy before, the ball forward, the science forward. No diagnostic test is perfect, but the ability to talk to a clinician about that and then know that it still was a better solution than what was currently available gave me the energy to then keep going, raise capital, move that product to ultimately help a lot of men in a search for understanding prostate cancer risk. And I've taken that lesson forward that, some of this stuff is not perfect. It's not pretty and that you read about and all that, but it's important courageous and humbling work to move science forward. And I use that as an example to just keep my chin up and keep moving forward.
I love it. Thank you so much, David. I really, really appreciate the conversation here. Everybody, thanks for joining us today. This was excellent. I loved all of the leadership knowledge that we got. David, again, thank you so much for your service. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show today. And yeah, everybody, please reach out to David Esposito on LinkedIn, ONL Therapeutics. We'll have the links to everything in the show notes here. But I appreciate everyone joining us. We're coming up on the holidays, so I'll say happy holidays to everybody. And let's continue to build something meaningful together. Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate it.